Happy to be here. Always happy to be a part of Xerces events. Xerces is my all-time favorite organization for conservation and for insects. And as you'll see, a number of the really sort of key projects to me that we've done in the last few years have been because of collaborations with the Xerces Society. So I want to tell you about work that we do to understand the status of Western butterflies in the modern era, also known as the Anthropocene. And when I say status, I'm referring to questions about population stability and stressors affecting populations, and also trying to understand and forecast which species are most susceptible. And I also kind of like to say, maybe even to admit when I start a talk like this, that none of the stuff I'm going to talk about is really what I thought I would be doing with my career. When I was a graduate student, I was interested in speciation, which is to say where species come from. And the fact is, we know a lot about how new species form. We know a lot less about the loss of species, about extinction. And unfortunately, given the Anthropocene, the modern era, we are now gaining opportunities to learn about extinction. But really, the reason that I shifted the direction of my career from evolutionary biology to Anthropocene is a particular result that turned up from the Central Valley of California. And I'll show you that result. It's really kind of a single graph that changed the direction of what I've been doing. And I'll get to that in a minute. These are the three data sources that we work with in my lab, myself, students, and colleagues. You might be familiar with the one in the middle there. So that's a map of NABA, North American Butterfly Association count circles across the West. They're color coded just by elevation. Those count circles happen across the whole country. So wherever you are, you can Google that and take part in a butterfly count if you want. That's actually a program that was started by the Xerces Society, but now run by NABA. I'll get back to that in a little bit. iNaturalist on the right there, that's the density of butterfly observations in the last 20 years in iNaturalist. I'm not going to mention that too much, although it will come back very briefly at one point. Mainly, I want to talk about the data source that you see on the left there. That's a picture of Northern California. And you see dots there that are essentially tracing the I-80 corridor, if you're familiar with the geography of that part of the state. Those 10 sites comprise the Shapiro Monitoring Program, which is the world's longest continuously operated monitoring program with now 53 years of continuous data. This program was started by my former advisor, Dr. Art Shapiro, who you see in the picture there in the early 1970s. And the 10 sites you can see in elevational profile on the right, where you see the Coast Range and the Central Valley, and then the Sierra Nevada. And the years next to each site are the years when continuous monitoring began. And continuous in this case means every other week the sites are visited and the presence or absence of all butterfly species is recorded, some 160 species of butterflies. Art continues to collect data remarkably at all of the low elevation sites, the 5 low elevation sites. And there, the butterfly season is essentially nonstop, especially with climate change and warming winters. Art has never stopped going out every 2 weeks at those sites, which, as far as I know, that sort of dedication to data collection by one person has no other equal in modern science, certainly in modern ecology. Out of my lab, we have taken over the monitoring of the 5 high elevation sites in the Sierra Nevada we've been doing for the last 6 years. So we've worked with data from these sites for a long time, but I can actually boil most of what we know down into 2 graphs that I'm going to show you now. And they look sort of complicated, but I'm going to use them as a jumping off point for a handful of stories about what's been happening to butterflies in Northern California. And then from Northern California, we will zoom out to all of the West, and then I'll briefly touch on all of North America, and then I'll end by telling you about some conservation specific activities that we try to do in my lab. Okay, so these graphs here, the top panel there shows results from the mountains in the cooler colors, and then the valleys in the hotter colors. Each dot there represents how good or bad of a butterfly year it was at that site in that year, with more positive values being good years and more negative values being bad years. And the values are averaged across all 160 species of butterflies. You probably see some patterns right away. So at low elevations in the bottom panel, there was a huge change in the 1990s, where you see this sort of downward trending line, and then it kind of levels out. And then you can see at one point there's actually a tiny bit of an upswing. The upswing is super interesting and actually gives one a bit of hope. I'm going to get way back. I'm going to get back to that at the way end, when we'll try to end on a hopeful note, but we have to talk about some sadder things first. Here's another picture of what's been happening in the Central Valley. So in the graph I was talking about, it's truncated to start in the late 80s. The graph on the right there is the full span of the data, which I mentioned before starts in the early 1970s, and that doesn't quite go up to the present. One problem about having 53 years of data is actually hard to look at it all at one time. But what you see here is kind of variation but stability through the 70s and 80s and into the early 90s. But then you see this downward trend where the line breaks and it starts going down. This is the result I alluded to when I was first talking that really changed the direction of my career, because it was both a mystery and a tragedy, and it was coming from locations essentially like, weedy natural areas in the north central valley, which is where I grew up as a kid. So I grew up in Roseau, which is near Sacramento, which is essentially identical to the ecology of these places. The decline in the number of butterfly species that could be seen at these central valley locations had declined so severely by 1999 that Art, who was collecting all this data, changed the way he collected it. Up until the late 90s, he had only been recording the presence or absence of butterflies, but there was such a severe decline in the number of butterflies flying around by the late 90s that he started counting individual butterflies, which is to say, it was really a dramatic shift. Okay, so seeing this, I was sort of nagging in the back of my mind through the 2000s. And then by the time I got a faculty job in 2008, I really couldn't look away. At that time, we started doing historical work, trying to understand which factors might have been associated with that severe change, with obvious candidates being climate change, habitat loss, and in habitat loss here we mean pavement, paving over of any open space, and then pesticides, because this is an intense agricultural area and an intense urban area, and there's a lot of pesticides that come out of urban areas. Now, development has a really strong ability to predict the ups and downs of these butterflies, and development pavement has been bad for butterflies in the Central Valley, but development did not show a break or a step change in the late 1990s. The only thing that we know of that showed a step change or a break in the late 1990s was the introduction of a new class of super powerful pesticides to the region, which is neonicotinoids. The graph you see on the left there, the three colored lines, blue, red, and gray, are the rise in neonicotinoid applications starting in 1995 to the present. And it's on a log scale, which means what looks like a straight line is actually an exponentially increasing line. So neonicotinoids, I'm sure many of you know from interaction with the Xerces Society website, are currently the most sort of powerful and widely used class of pesticides in the world. They are nicotine derivatives. So nicotine evolved naturally as an anti-herbivore, as an as a defense in plants. And then clever chemists have created derivatives of nicotine, which are now applied to crops and other plants worldwide, as a neurotoxin for insects. The diabolical part about neonicotinoids is that they go systemic in plants. So a farmer can plant seeds that are dusted with pesticide dust, and then the growing plant takes up the toxin and becomes a toxic plant throughout its lifetime, which probably has been quite detrimental for many wild insects, including butterflies. So our data suggested that the rise of pesticides was really bad for butterflies in the Central Valley. That raises the obvious hypothesis that if you look at the Central Valley, and there's an aerial picture, um, it's a complicated patchwork landscape. There's a lot of agriculture. That landscape is not inherently bad for insects. In fact, agricultural margins can be quite productive for native insects if they are left, messy. If there's native plants growing in the margins, and even exotic plants can be used by insects. But our results suggested that those marginal spaces that can be good for insects have become toxic. I have no ecotoxicological background, ecotoxicology as the study of toxins and their ecological impacts. At this point, I turned to the ecotoxicological literature, and I was totally surprised to see how rarely ecotoxicologists have gone to landscapes like that and asked, what kind of contamination is happening? How many pesticides are accumulating in spaces being used by native animals? I was lucky then to partner with the Xerces Society on a project that asked that question using milkweeds. Of course, milkweeds as hosts we care about for the monarch butterfly. The map you see on the left there is a map of part of the Central Valley. The red shading in the background shows the diversity of pesticides applied. It's a very complicated agricultural landscape, so the pesticide landscape is complicated. Then the dots are places that we sampled that included agricultural margins, so milkweeds growing on the edges of ag, wildlife refuges, and a couple of other places. And we then packaged up the plants and sent them off to have chemistry done and came back with a rather stunning result. That's a busy thing to look at. I don't expect you to get the details of that out of that, but what that table is pesticide compounds going down the left side, and then the little columns are individual locations that were sampled, where each location is represented by mini plants that were ground up and studied chemically for pesticides. And it was very ubiquitous contamination, a total of 64 pesticides detected from milkweed leaves, an average of 9 compounds per plant. And I think most remarkably, every single leaf had at least some pesticide in or on it. And 58 out of 227 samples, which is to say 26% of the leaves, had a particular compound, chlorantraniliprole, above a level known to have a serious lethal effect for monarch caterpillars. That's pretty bad, and we have to remember here, which I haven't said, although you might know, is that the vast majority of pesticides that are used, we have no idea what they do to any non-pest lepidopteran, which is to say we don't know what impacts they have for butterflies because figuring that out is not part of the pesticide regulation process. Okay, so but there's very few of these that have been studied. Of the few that have been studied, we know that one of them has a lethal effect for more than a quarter of the plants that we sampled. This matters a lot when you think about monarch conservation, because I've driven across the Central Valley with biologists who say, people talk about restoring habitat for monarchs. How can that be needed? You can see milkweeds growing in all of these ditches. And indeed, it's a milkweed, right? It grows in agricultural ditches, but it's a toxic landscape. We need to actually figure out how to restore and not have it be a toxic landscape. This study here inspired a number of different follow-up studies. What I haven't told you is that a couple of the plants, two of the plant sources that went into this study were nurseries. So simply walking into a nursery, buying some milkweeds off the shelf, studying them for chemistry. And we found in this study that those milkweed plants were contaminated with pesticides as well. That seemed pretty important, especially given the sort of desire that many of us have to go out and buy milkweeds and put them in our yards for monarch butterflies. So it raised the question, are we buying toxic plants from milkweeds? The Xerces Society, again, did wonderful work organizing their folks across the country in all of the locations that you see there, covering the migratory range of the monarch butterfly, went into stores, small nurseries, big nurseries, bought plants, processed them for chemistry, and asked, are nursery plants contaminated? Unfortunately, the results are pretty bad. Very similar to the results from sampling in the North Central Valley. This graph here, and I know the details you can't really see, it's flipped. In this case, the columns are pesticide compounds and the rows are individual stores that were visited, organized by state. Very ubiquitous, 61 different pesticides sampled. Every single leaf had some toxins in it. At least 2 compounds was the minimum, and some leaves had as many as 28 pesticides in them, plants bought from the stores. The only good news was, whereas the Central Valley had a high prevalence of lethal concentrations, these had a high prevalence of sublethal concentrations, which is to say concentrations of pesticides that were bad enough to cause developmental defects. For example, caterpillars developing into adults that may be too small to effectively migrate, which isn't good. It's only slightly better than lethality. But again, the problem that only a few of these compounds have even been studied for effects on monarch or any other non-pest lepidopteran. Okay, but what do you do about it? Getting this data, our next hope was that we'd be able to give some guidance about the nurseries that should be visited, because maybe it would be the case that the big box stores had more lethal plants or more, toxic plants on their shelves. So we attempted to explain toxicity of our samples by store size, which is what I'm going to show you here. Store size is on the x-axis, measured as just the number of stores in a chain, and then the y-axis is the number of plants or the percentage of plants with an exceedance. And exceedance here means some leaf that had concentrations of a pesticide above a level causing one of those developmental defects I mentioned. Unfortunately, store size did not predict that. It doesn't matter if you go to small stores or big stores, you're equally likely to pull a plant off the shelf that has some leaf that has some toxin above a level that causes a developmental problem for monarchs. This is pretty bad news. Um, how about those labels? You're in the nursery and you see, pollinator friendly, good for butterfly gardens, helps the bees, those kind of labels on plants. I have often picked those plants. Of course, we should remember that there's, those labels come in all kinds of different forms and aren't necessarily backed by any kind of regulation. The next thing I'm going to show you, this result here, is probably the most depressing thing you'll hear today, or at least I hope it's the most depressing thing you hear today because it's pretty bad. Um, Not only were those labeled plants not better than the unlabeled plants, but plants with a label on them saying butterfly friendly or whatever were twice as likely to have a leaf with toxins in it above a level that causes developmental harm to monarchs. Horrible. Um, we don't really understand why. There are obviously some different supply chains feeding these sort of different kinds of plants to these stores, and there's a lot more work to be done. This has inspired further follow up studies that I could talk more about if people are interested. But for now, I want to kind of move away from the Central Valley. Apologies, my phone is ringing. It'll stop in just a second. So that was about the decline in the valleys that started in the mid 90s, really, and has plateaued. We think that that is mainly driven by pesticides, but also by development, which I didn't say as much about. At that time, let's say in the early 2000s, early 2010s, when we were working on that result, we thought that the mountain butterflies were pretty stable. We actually hadn't started to worry about them yet. Now, looking back, we can see that the mountains were in a subtle decline, starting possibly in the early 2000s, but it didn't become noticeable, the decline in the mountains, until this happened. Any of you in the West probably remember the mega drought years. So this was 2011 to 2015, when the Western US was hotter and drier than it had been in 1,000 years. These were really dramatic years to be walking around in the mountains, the Sierra Nevada mountains, counting butterflies, because it was quite noticeable. There were just fewer butterflies flying around, and there's a couple of really interesting comparative results here. So the red arrows there are pointing to sort of the depth of decline in the mountains and in the valley. And in both cases, on a standardized scale, which lets us compare these sort of different sites, the depth of decline is about a half of a standard deviation away from a historical baseline. This is weird and was a surprise, because what this suggests is the impacts of climate change in the mountains, because the mountains, as far as we know, are not impacted directly by development or pesticides. The effects of climate change in the mountains can drive butterflies to suffer as much as the combined effects of pesticides, development, and climate change at low elevation. That was a bit of a mystery that I think we've mostly solved. I'm going to tell you why. It's sort of a multifaceted story. But another surprise here is that when the mega drought started, so 2011 into 2012, I thought that the Central Valley populations would really be pushed over the edge, because actually, they had been already stressed by all these things I've talked about. And so having extra hot and dry years we thought would be terrible. In contrast, we thought that the mountain populations would be relatively robust. These are ectotherms, right? Butterflies, animals that regulate their body temperature by adjusting where they are in the environment. So it seemed entirely reasonable, given climate change effects, that they could shift, for example, from south-facing slopes to north-facing slopes and mitigate or buffer a lot of these changes. That was wrong. In fact, it was 100% wrong. The valley had a few pretty good years in the mega drought. I alluded to that before. We'll get back to it. The ma- the mountains really suffered. Okay, so why? Let me tell you how we've sort of pieced together the study, the answer to why climate change can be so bad for in the mountains, but not as bad in the valley. What you see there, and it's really a tip of the iceberg in terms of a lot of statistical work, um, is the effect of nighttime temperatures on butterflies across the elevational gradient. You see that downward trending line. That downward trending line means that warming nights have a more negative effect on butterflies in the mountains than in the valley. Okay, and I'll get back to a bit to why that might be. But does that tell us why climate change is worse for butterflies in the mountains? It doesn't, except it kind of does when you see this next effect. What this is minimum temperatures, so night average daily minimum temperatures of how warm the night is for all of the sites put onto a standardized scale. So that's why the y-axis there doesn't look like temperature, but it's standardized so we can compare valleys and mountains. The hot colors there are the low elevation sites. So you see some ups and downs, some warmer night years, some cooler night years. But the cooler lines there, the cooler colors, that sort of gentle J shape going up, those are the mountainsides where it turns out that nighttime temperatures have been gradually rising for many years. And this turns out to be a widespread global effect of elevation. As you go up in elevation, climate change impacts on the nighttime temperatures in particular are more severe, which is to say, the difference in terms of temperature between night and day is collapsing rapidly at high elevations, not so much at low elevations. This has undoubtedly a number of knock on effects for plants and animals. And walking around in the drought years, we really thought that the effect on the butterflies was going to be mediated through the plants. So here you see a picture of one of our big meadows. This is at Donner Pass. On the left there, I don't know if you can see, depending on the color on your computer, there's a lot of brown in that meadow, and that's August 2012. That's August can be an amazingly productive year for or month for butterflies in Sierra Nevada. And then on the right, that same meadow in August, immediately after the mega drought year. So walking around in that meadow on the left, dry plants in the middle of summer, we really thought the mega drought years were having negative impacts on the butterflies because they were drying out plants, which of course are host plants for caterpillars and also nectar sources for adults. Okay, this inspired a lot of further historical detective work where we're trying to understand what really is the mechanism by which drought affects butterflies. Is it direct stress on individual butterflies, or is it effects through the plants? Kind of remarkably to me, we keep finding evidence for direct effects on butterflies. When you see just a slice of that here, right? This is a three-dimensional graph, which I know are kind of obnoxious to read, but let me tell you what's going on there. The two axes that are sort of on the, excuse me, are on the floor there are minimum temperatures. So again, this is nighttime temperatures. And then April 1 snowpack, which we use as an index of snow for the year, which it works for these sites. And then the y-axis is the probability of occurrence for an average butterfly in the coming spring. The red dot are the conditions at the height of the mega drought, when nighttime temperatures in the winter were quite warm, and April 1 snowpack was really low. So the height of the mega drought years, it was not just hot and dry in the summer, but the winters were too warm, especially at night, and the snowpack was low or ephemeral, and that was associated with a low probability of seeing butterflies in the coming spring. So why then is the interesting question, right? What's the biology here? We have a couple of hypotheses, but think about butterflies spending the winter in the mountains in the western US. Many of them spend the winter as eggs, which they've been doing for tens of thousands of years. So as summer ends, the last adult butterflies will be flying around looking for nectar, laying eggs. Those eggs then are prepared to go dormant under a blanket of snow and wait out the winter and then hatch in the spring. That's historically what they've done for tens of thousands of years. Now, with recent climate change, that blanket of insulating snow is becoming thinner and it's becoming more ephemeral. So it comes and goes throughout the winter more often than it used to. That's for sure what was happening in the mega drought years. So you combine the effect of a thinner blanket with warmer nighttime temperatures, and we think a couple of things could be happening. One, and it's really what I put my money on, is that when you lack that blanket and it's too warm, you're sort of always almost coming out of dormancy and maybe burning up too much reserves that you have stored up for the winter. And then you may not even have the energy left to hatch by the time spring comes, or you hatch too soon. You might hatch under the blanket of snow because you've been too warm, or you hatch maybe right as the snow is melting, but it's still too early and there aren't any plants to eat. So, none of this is to say that plants aren't important. Um, in the studies we've done so far, we've used satellite data to sort of measure the greenness of plants, which isn't very satisfying. It's something. What we're doing moving forward is we've added a new kind of data collection to our long term study. Now we go out with roughly the same frequency that we count butterflies in the mountains and we count caterpillars, which is what you see volunteers doing here because it's a very labor intensive effort. We need to know about what the caterpillars are doing when they are dense, when they are happy. And ultimately, that will let us really understand climate change effects in terms of, is it a plant effect, which we'd see in caterpillars, or is it a direct physiological effect of, for example, heat stress on other life history stages. But the caterpillar work is really intensive. We go out every 2 weeks, we collect caterpillars, we have to bring them back to the lab to rear them, to identify them. It will be 10 to 15 years until we have enough data to really understand climate change impacts. But I'm excited about this work because it's novel. As far as I know, there aren't any other butterfly monitoring programs that simultaneously do caterpillars from the wild and adult butterflies. Okay, so that has all been about the Northern California and the Sierra Nevada in particular, where I work. I want to zoom out now, and this will be briefer. Zoom out here to the Western U.S. and then zoom out even more briefly to North America, and then we'll end with some conservation ideas. So I showed you this map early on. This is the North American Butterfly Association count circles. I call them 4th of July counts because they tend to be around that part of summer. This is when a group of enthusiasts, often enthusiasts with experts, go out and count all the butterflies they can find in a certain area. We use this data. This is actually our pandemic era project, so some years ago now, to ask if the declines we were seeing in Northern California at both low and high elevation, if those were mirrored by declines across the whole region. And unfortunately, we found that they are very closely mirrored by that. So we found, using 72 of the navicites that had the most robust years of data, an average of a 1.6% annual decline in the density of butterflies flying around those sites. That's a compounded annual decline, which is quite severe. You would not be happy if your bank account was declining at that rate. If you imagine going to a beautiful mountain meadow 20 years ago, spending the whole day there and seeing, let's say, 1,000 individual butterflies flying around, which isn't that hard to imagine. Our results say that if you went back to that meadow now, you would see about 725 individual butterflies flying around. So that's the change over 20 years. That's a huge change if you think about all the important ecosystem services from butterflies and other insects, pollination, food for other trophic levels, etc. That result, unfortunately, was robust to different subsets of the data, so we can exclude the most common species, and it's actually an even slightly more severe decline. So a number of surprises here. One, I was frankly surprised that we would see declines that severe across the whole West because, as I'm sure many of you know, the Western US is full of amazing and relatively pristine open spaces, except they are impacted by climate change. And these estimates of decline in the order of 1 to 2% are very similar to estimates of decline that have been reported for butterflies and even other insect groups in other parts of the country and even other parts of the world, which is to say the butterflies in the West are part of the biodiversity crisis and insect declines in general. As with the Central Valley data, we did a lot of historical work with this result to try to understand the causes of decline. And now, oh, I should have said this before flipping to that. One thing about the NABA sites that's different from the Shapiro sites is the NABA sites tend to be in really pristine areas. And that's because, well, they're volunteer chosen. They're places that it's nice to go out in the middle of summer and count butterflies. So the NABA data is actually not so good for understanding the impacts of development or pesticides. It is really good for understanding climate change impacts because it's in these relatively pristine places that are mostly impacted by climate change. So that's what we did. And we found that places that in the West that were warming more in the fall are seeing fewer butterflies. Warming is not equal across the seasons, just like it's not equal across elevations, which is something I didn't know until I actually started working with the data. Fall is warming, for example, more rapidly than summer. And what you see in this kind of messy looking graph there on the x-axis, the low axis, the horizontal axis, that's the difference between fall and summer warming. So farther to the right on the x-axis are places where fall is warming more rapidly than summer. And the y-axis is the rate of change in butterfly density. Are we seeing more butterflies or fewer butterflies? The orange square there highlights locations where fall is warming more rapidly than summer, and we're seeing fewer butterflies. Why? Um, I my hypothesis here is twofold. One is that warming fall also likely involves some of those mechanisms I alluded to earlier, where it could be messing with the sort of earliest overwintering stage. The eggs that are being laid down for the next generation are too warm. They may be failing to sort of go into their winter sleep. I also think that fall might be kind of an Achilles heel for arid Western ecosystems, where for many butterflies, that's sort of the last chance for females flying around to gather nectar and have the resources to lay eggs for the next generation. There's also mating that goes on right at the end of summer. And if the nectar resources are failing at that crucial point, then that may sort of impact negatively the next generation. So, sort of to recap up till now, there's no doubt that development is bad for butterflies, and I didn't show you those results directly because it's not hard to imagine that pavement is bad. Pesticides, it's been surprising to me the magnitude and depth of contamination in the Central Valley. And then moving out from there, climate change has quite severe impacts across the whole Western US. And I still haven't gotten back to that sort of fascinating upswing of a few good years the Central Valley had during the mega drought. I will. But let's proceed with this hypothesis that climate change is actually really bad for butterflies out in the wildlands. Here's a picture of climate change across the whole country, and I know everybody has seen graphs like this in the press. I like this one in particular because this is from a study where researchers asked if national park lands were being more severely impacted by climate change than non-national park lands. And actually they are, for the simple reason that there are more national park lands by area in the Western US than in the Eastern US. The graph you see, or the image you see there, shows the Western US heating up more than other parts of the country. And here are drying trend. It's a little harder to see, but if you look closely, you can see the kind of salmon colored splotches there are drying areas. Tons of them in the West, especially the Southwest and sort of up the middle of sort of the Great Basin, very severe drying. So if our hypothesis is correct that climate change is bad for butterflies out in the otherwise untouched open areas, that would predict that there would be the most severe spots of decline are in the Western US. I was lucky in the last few years to be part of a working group that brought together results from monitoring programs across the whole country. So this was a USGS, funded working group. You see the dots there are monitoring locations where we brought them together, 35 different monitoring programs. Up till now, I've only been talking about two, the Shapiro program and the NABA program. Here's 35 different programs. Unfortunately, found results across the whole country that are quite consistent with what I've been telling you so far. Overall, a 22% decrease in the total number of individual butterflies flying around over the last 20 years. So that's like one out of every 5 butterflies gone over the last 20 years. And then on the left there, where you see the sort of dots and the lines arranged vertically, the most severe declines were in the Southwest and the mountain prairie region, which is that sort of the western middle band of the West. Most severe butterfly declines, and less severe, for example, in the Southeast, where drying and warming aspects of climate change have not been as severe. Tallying up impacts on individual species, roughly 10 times as many individual species are declining across the US as are increasing. What you see is that pile up of red bars there. That's the count of declining species. Okay, let me switch now to conservation because that's enough bad news, right? So what do we do? Um, what do we do in the face of all of this bad news? One things that we've been doing, I know there's too many details there to focus on. We've been gathering up information on risk for all Western butterflies. So we've tallied up threats and decline rates for 396 species of Western butterflies so that we can move from just saying there's a problem, but to focusing on individual species. And I'd like to think that some of this work has motivated the moving forward of legal protections for some other species, not just the monarch. The monarch is in the top list, of course, but there's about 20 to 30 species that are declining as severely as the monarch. We can also use these kind of results to understand the biology of who's declining. So far, we know that being small bodied and living in drier areas leads to the greatest risk in the rest. We can also look at the distribution of risk, and by risk I mean your sort of probability of declining in the coming years. We can look at that distribution from an evolutionary perspective, which you see here as a circle phylogeny. A phylogeny shows the relationships among species wrapped around to be a circle. The colors are the different families of butterflies. Why is this conservation, you might say? It looks like basic research. It actually is conservation because this lets us talk about clusters of related species that are at risk. In particular, in the blues, hair streaks, and coppers, there are clusters of species that are at risk. For example, the genus Lycaena coppers are in very sort of consistent decline across the West. And there are others. We can also map risk. On the left there, you see densities of at-risk species. So for example, the Colorado Plateau, the Northern Sierra, the Southern California coast have high densities of at-risk species. This is useful to land managers, conservation biologists. On the right there, that map shows the density of species that we think are at risk, but that don't have any monitoring data. So this is motivating folks to, for example, go start new NABA circles in those areas so that we can start getting more information on species that we think are at risk. But ultimately, it's individual species that will motivate conservation. Here's a species that I think should be the poster child for insect conservation in the West. So this is the West Coast lady, Vanessa annabella. There's a lot going on here, but all the little scatter plots are downward trends, which is to say everywhere this butterfly lives, it's become harder to find. And by way of humility, this is not a butterfly that anyone would have expected or predicted to be in decline 20 years ago. It's a large-bodied species. It's dispersive. It has a number of hosts, both native and exotic, that are pretty robust, live in all kinds of different situations. But everywhere we look for it, it's in severe decline. And I have some hypotheses that I don't want to get into right now, but this is a motivator for conservation. And this is a species that we want anybody to go out and be looking for. Others, the so-called common sooty wing. When I was a kid in the North Central Valley, it was just dirt common in weed lots in Sacramento. Now is being extirpated or going through local extinctions in much of the North Central Valley. Also marbles, so the large marble on the left there, had some great decades in the 20th century when it had actually figured out how to use some exotic host plants. But then that seemingly has all gone sour as it is in widespread decline, especially in California. Not everybody is doing badly. Some people like to talk about winners and losers in the Anthropocene. I don't really like that phrase because it implies the game is over. But of course, for these organisms, the game has only just begun in terms of human impacts. But this is the Western tiger swallowtail, which is doing really well anywhere we look for it throughout the West, including in urban areas where it can use some trees, for example, in Reno, where I am, cottonwoods that grow in urban settings, but it can use really the high canopy, which might be why it's doing well. And speaking of doing well, I promised to get back to this interesting little blip here. Let me tell you about this, and then I'll kind of wrap up here. So that arrow is pointing to these brief upswing. The Central Valley butterflies had a remarkably good set of a few years during the mega drought years. They had an upswing at the point that we would thought they would have a decline. And this definitely turns out to be one of those exception proves the rule kind of thing, or it's at least been quite informative. And I'm not going to show you all the data because we don't have time, but what we figured out is that those hot and dry springs in the mega drought years led to earlier emergence. So we saw butterflies start flying earlier. They then had greater population growth during those warm and dry years. They basically had more time for their populations to grow because most of the butterflies that live at low elevation have many generations per year. In contrast, in the mountains, most of the species have a single generation per year. That's just sort of part of adaptation to living in the high mountains is you're adapted to have a single generation. There's usually not time for more, but that means in the mega drought years when you emerge much earlier in the mountains, you can't take advantage of the extra time. You still have your one generation and you're done. You suffer the hot dry conditions and that's it. Whereas in the valley, there's some suffering with hot and dry conditions, but you have time for an extra generation, and that alone builds up some extra population size. Now, it didn't last. They crashed back to the sort of the low plateau that they've been at after the drought, but it's an illustration that there is resilience built into even sort of weedy, degraded landscapes, and we shouldn't write them off in terms of conservation. Okay, let me wrap up with a few points, and then I want to end for an advertisement for a project that I think will be of interest to scientists and the general public. So butterflies are responding to the stress of the Anthropocene. I'm sure it's not a surprise to anybody. Declines of 1 to 2% annually estimated from a range of species, habitats, and regions, which is consistent with rates of decline for butterflies and other insects in other parts of the world. We know what the causes are. The causes are habitat loss, habitat degradation, and climate change. Sort of the relative importance of those three main drivers is different in different areas, and degradation includes not just pesticides, which I've focused on, but for example, light pollution and other things. But we know that those are the causes. Um, we also know that habitat loss and degradation have been most important historically. But it's also the case that the effects of climate change seem to be on the rise, and they are layering on top of those other historical problems. And we know what to do. Of course, we need to reduce our carbon input, the atmosphere, and fight climate change. We also need to preserve remaining habitat, and we need to advocate for sensible pesticide use. The latter one is sort of close to my heart, having been sort of sucked into the toxicological world. Pesticide use is hopeful to me because it's something that is amenable to really immediate improvement. We can all stop using pesticides in our yards because we don't need perfect roses. Okay, so now I want to end with an advertisement. Everything that I've been talking about so far has been about declines, right? Things going downhill. And the reason we worry about declines, of course, is because declines can lead to extinctions, and extinctions are happening. But the fact is that the scientific world is not doing a very good job, in my opinion, keeping track of extinctions, with the exception of a couple of groups of vertebrates that are charismatic. For example, we do know how many mammals and birds we have lost, and they're pretty shocking numbers. If you don't know this, apologies. This is the worst thing you'll hear today. It's even worse than the pesticide labels in nurseries. 77 mammal species extinct since about 1500, about 160 species of birds. That's a lot. And I think it's a powerful thing to remember because I find that even my fellow scientists tend to forget that extinction is going on. But we have a far less good count as soon as we get outside of mammals and birds. Probably in the order of 600 to 700 species of plants have gone extinct. Probably globally 10 to 15 species of butterflies. Don't really have a good count there. Good count for North America, not for the world. And then if we switch from butterflies to insects, big old question mark. We truly do not know how many insects are going extinct right now, even to a good order of magnitude guess. That has led to my idea for the creation of a journal that gathers records of extinction. And I'm calling it the Journal of Lost Species. And the reason I'm mentioning it to you is because there is an important interaction here between scientists and butterfly enthusiasts and nature enthusiasts. And the word loss is important and interesting here in the title. Rather than the Journal of Extinct Species, I'm calling it the Journal of Lost Species because lost things can be found again. And this has actually been shown with vertebrates in particular, that if you publicize the fact that we can't find something, an animal, a lot of people are motivated to go look for it. And sometimes, not all the time, of course, unfortunately, they can be found again. So lost, for example, might mean a species has not been seen in, let's say, 10 years, and we really need to go look for it. So I am organizing this journal that is going to be a record of the things that are lost. I want everybody to be able to go there and see the things that need to be looked for. And I guarantee that wherever you live, there is going to be something that needs to be looked for. For example, in my backyard, essentially, is this species. This is the peavine blue. So if anybody's been to Reno, peavine is our mountain just north of the city, but it directly abuts the city. It's a very popular recreation area. This is a butterfly that is named from that mountain. It's lost. We can't find it. We've been looking for many years. Um, but the thing is, most people wouldn't know to look for it because there hasn't been a place where this kind of loss is publicized. But once the loss is publicized, you can use iNaturalist, you can use your phone to go out and look for it. This was just one example. What I want there to be is lots of examples so we can all be looking for lost species. I think Rachel was going to put a link in the chat for a Google form where, if you're interested in this, you can put your email, and I will put you on an email list. I'm hoping for our first issue for the journal to be released late in 2025. And if you go to this QR code, it will also take you to this Google form. I also have a couple questions there that just sort of help me understand who's interested. And I'll leave that up for just a second there. But like I said, Rachel will put the link in the chat. And then I want to go to a thank you slide because that's all I have to say. And I'm happy to stick around for questions. As I had mentioned at the start to Rachel and Amber, that I hear myself talk plenty. So I don't need to hear myself talk anymore, but I'm happy to hear what questions you might have. And I will leave that thanks up there. The number of people that I need to thank for this collaborative work is really huge. Xerces Society definitely being one of them. And with that, I think I will stop sharing. Okay.
Thank you so much, Matt. That was a lot of information. It was really good, a little depressing, but also hopeful because there are people like you and a lot of people out there doing good work. So yeah, we do have some questions, and just as a reminder, if folks have questions, please put them in the Q&A. And then I did put that link there as the sign up sheet if you're interested in learning more about the Journal of Lost Species. I love the idea. We did a podcast recording. It's not coming out for a couple more weeks, but on Bug Banter, we had Matt come, and it was a really great conversation. So I encourage you to listen to that podcast and our other ones, of course, too. But just talking about letting those species not be lost forever and that we remember them and try to not let that happen to other butterflies and other insects that we love. So I'm going to kick us off here with Lori's question. They were wondering, so you had a graph, I think about 3 or 4 slides in, it had 4 different abbreviations, and it kind of showed the decline in abundance of butterflies. And it was, I'm assuming, 4 different types of butterflies: SM, NS, WS, and RC.
Those were locations. So
Okay.
my bad for not explaining that. Yeah, that's right.
Okay. That makes sense. I was trying to look up the paper. I was like, maybe I can figure it out, but the
Yeah.
paper is also pending. So perfect. Thank you.
Yep. Yeah, those are locations, and in terms of species, it goes from about 30 species that could be seen at those locations 30 years ago to about 20 now.
Yeah, I had similar trouble. I was trying to find the answer to that on the side as well. Thanks for clearing that up.
Yeah, it's good. I'm glad you asked. I actually need to make a note to myself.
All right, well, we have other questions coming in. This one, Portia asks, how can we be sure the milkweed we purchase isn't contaminated? They buy a lot of Monrovia brand plants at a big box store.
Yep. So more work needs to be done, but I'll tell you the recommendations that I've gotten from folks that understand pesticide chemistry better than I do. One is if you is to throw away as much of the dirt as you can. And this sounds weird, but you buy a pot, right? And the tendency is to keep all that dirt that comes in the pot because it feels like good potting soil. But a lot of the pesticides that go into plants in nurseries are actually injected through the soil. So, for example, fungicides will be injected into the soil, which then goes systemic into the plant, and that can be bad for insects. So, as you're putting that plant in the ground, just sort of throw away whatever you can of that soil. I don't think you need to be sort of obsessively cleaning the roots, but maybe just don't keep all of it. Then, when you get it in the ground, for the first couple of days, water the leaves heavily because a lot of the pesticides are not systemic. So a lot of the pesticides are actually on the surface of the leaves, and some of those can be washed off, right? So ditch some of the dirt, give the leaves sort of a heavy wash with water for a couple days, and then perennials are going to be better than annuals. Anything that resprouts in your garden the next year will have lost most of those toxins that it came with. So if you can build your garden around perennials, that's really good. I like to go out and buy a ton of annuals in the spring too, but it's I have a little bit less enthusiasm for that now after seeing these results. And other than that, we need to figure out a way to put pressure on these companies to clean up their act in terms of the plants they're putting in stores.
That's such a good tip. I did not think about that. So I'll be doing that from now on. Ryan had a question about the swallowtail that seems to be on the upswing. On a more positive note, more about why it is doing well and what does it say about other competitive butterfly species?
Yep. I, I don't think that it's an issue of competition per se. I think, whenever you have a stressor like warming conditions or whatnot, out of the great diversity of insects, there's always going to be a couple of species for whom those conditions are just pretty good, right? And that like kind of makes sense. Nature is diverse. As the climate changes over the eons, at some point in time, there's species that like those conditions more than others. And some of that is going on. It happens to be that species seems to like the hot and dry conditions that are going on. And it may be the case that being able to lay eggs high up in the canopy of these trees is also possibly a good strategy. Maybe it allows it to persist in urban areas above the pesticide drift that does happen in urban areas. And we didn't even talk about that. But other than that, I can't actually pretend that I know. And that's something that we need to figure out. Exactly. Some species like that are doing better than others. Oh, and I just saw, I know I should be relying on you for the question, but somebody just said get native plant seeds and seedlings. Yes, I should have said that anything you can grow from seeds or from smaller seedlings is going to have zero or less pesticides than something you buy as a full grown plant.
Thank you.
Yeah, great tip. Thank you. Okay, going to combine a couple questions here. We have some people interested. Have you found any studies on truck-based spraying of pyrethroids in neighborhoods targeting mosquitoes, looking at the effect on disease and on non-target insect collateral damage? And then a similar question about emerald ash borer pesticides, the neonics that are injected in tree bark, if they affect non-target species when applied correctly.
Yep. For the first one, another Xerces study that I've been lucky to help with a bit has looked at the chemicals sprayed by trucks for mosquitoes in a couple of different places, and those analyses are in progress. But not surprisingly, there is drift of those pesticides, and we're working on that. So stay tuned for that. I'm sure something will be posted on the Xerces websites about that. Then the second question, I don't know the details of the chemicals injected for emerald ash borer. I do know that chemicals injected into trees can go fully systemic in ways that affect things, for example, eating foliage. And when I rail against pesticides, I'm also happy to be realistic and know that there are going to be places where the trade-off might be worth it, right? That we might want to act against a particular pest, even if it has negative consequences. That's going to happen, but I know the details of that chemistry in particular.
Thank you. Sebastian is wondering, wonderful presentation, they said. Does your work ever involve habitat rehabilitation once you recognize these declines through your research? So what's the follow-up on these declines?
Yeah, mostly I've relied on conservation organizations like Xerces Society to motivate habitat restoration. So it's not what I do per se, but I can point to an issue that's I think interesting to me. So the Central Valley again, where we work in terms of our low elevation monitoring sites, very intense pesticide contamination. People want to do restoration there. The question is, how do you put new habitat into a place that's so subject to pesticide drift? So one thing that I'm interested in figuring out is how we build in or pesticide barriers to habitat, which might be particular walls of shrubbery that protect other plants. So that's in progress, but I don't myself do that restoration.
Thanks for that. Similarly, And Sarah wants to know, how can they get involved in butterfly counts and other related community science? Maybe
Yeah.
not the habitat restoration work, but at least the counts.
Yeah, great question. So the North American Butterfly Association count circles. Googling that will get you to an informational page so you can figure out when one of those happens in your area. And you just show up and you can learn butterflies as you go. And it's a single day and it's really great. Um, Another thing I like to stress is that do it using iNaturalist is really amazing data. I didn't actually manage to come back to that, but we have used iNaturalist records and they're super important. Even if you only take pictures of a couple of butterflies in the whole summer, it's real data that is accessed and used. And then, yeah, that's all I got. Those are two options for volunteering.
Awesome. All right, a couple more questions here. Terrell is wondering, impressive data sets, great presentation. It can be tough not to feel pessimistic when faced with such significant declines. What are some aspects of your upcoming work that you are excited or hopeful about?
Yeah, yeah, it is depressing. I actually get excited about the pesticide work because I do feel like it's a place where immediate change can happen. There's a study, yet another that I haven't mentioned, Xerces study that I've been able to be a part of, looked at pesticide contamination in urban areas in Sacramento and Albuquerque. And there's a lot, which is to say people really are overusing pesticides in urban areas. And I think it's a exciting area for change because there's impacts on human health too. And I think cities are going to respond to the fact that when they overmanage their green areas, that stuff drifts all over the city. And in these studies, the data that we've been working with, even in yards of friends of Xerces that are not spraying pesticides, they have plants that are contaminated with pesticides because they're in this urban matrix where there's just too much spraying going on. So something hopeful, I think, is to really get after both how city parks are managed and homeowner associations, which is politics at a local level that really anyone can do it. I mean, you can call your local Parks and Rec department and just say, "Hey, what can you tell me about pesticides being sprayed out there?" But it's still kind of depressing. Thing that I really get excited about these days is actually our caterpillar work that I mentioned, where we're now monitoring caterpillars along with adults because most of those are moths. Because of course, for every one butterfly species, there's 10 moth species out there. So we're getting the chance to see lots of species that we didn't know lived here because people just don't look that often. We're getting to learn what plants different moths eat. We're also learning which parasitoids, flies and wasps that attack caterpillars, which species of those attack different caterpillar species. So there's just sort of a lot of discovery of biodiversity in the mountains that still gives me hope because there's a lot out there.
Kind of just jumped in and started answering this question already, so I'm going to follow up with it. Portia's said, "Thank you so much. Super interesting presentation, but wanted to know why you're rearing the caterpillars you're collecting during the survey instead of just doing abundance counts. What information specifically are you hoping to find from that project?"
Yep. It is a good question because it is lethal sampling that we have to do, and maybe we won't have to do it someday. But for now, we can't identify most of these species by looking at the caterpillars. Some of them can be, but for the most part, we have to rear them to figure out what they are. We rear them in the lab; they turn into adults, then we can identify them. Also, unless you rear them, you don't discover the wasps and the flies that are attacking them, and the wasps and the flies are just super important parts of these ecosystems, and some of them are new to science, and it's the way we discover them. So the caterpillar sampling is lethal sampling for now. We do, however, whenever we're rearing a caterpillar, we take pictures of all of the different life stages. So the different instars, which are the different developmental stages. So we're building up this resource such that someday we won't have to do that,
Mhm.
at least as much, but that is what we do for now. I should also say, though, in terms of the lethal impact, because I do think about that, obviously, right? When we go out to these sites, if our transects that we block for butterflies might be 8 miles long, and we stop at a very few number of spots, 2 or 3 spots, and stake out a 5 or 10 meter diameter circle and collect caterpillars there. So it's absolutely minuscule the area from which we collect caterpillars from. So that's a good thing too.
Yeah, thank you for explaining that. I think it'd be hard from an outside perspective, the lethal sampling, but I think you're very mindful about how you're doing it.
So,
Following up, excuse me, on more questions of assessment and research process, Anthony wants to know, have you used photogrammetry and LiDAR for assessment of areas that contain high numbers of insects, pollinators, and birds? I also thank you for the great talk.
yeah, I appreciate the question. And there are a lot of people developing new technologies for censusing insects. Um, we've used satellite based information for plants where you can sort of measure the greenness of a meadow by satellite. I have not done that for insects. And I'm fully interested to see what folks are going to come up with there, but it's not actually what I personally want to do because we're sufficiently busy counting butterflies and rearing caterpillars. And I have not yet seen a technology that's a substitute for that. I, and I also I worry a bit about electronic pollution. There are folks wanting to develop sort of these portable insect monitoring stations where it's a little camera that connects to satellite and you can stick it next to a patch of flowers and it records what's there. It's a nice idea, but I also sort of don't love the thought of covering the mountains in these portable cameras. We have enough electronic waste in the world. But to answer your question, there is exciting stuff going on there. It's not what I do.
Thanks for explaining that.
A clarification question from Tracy. Can you remind us what percentage of nursery bought plants have significant amounts of pesticides?
Yeah, it's a tricky thing to put a final number on, mainly because again, most of the compounds have not been studied, right? Um, for the compounds that have been studied, it was roughly 30% of plants have a compound that exceeds a developmental effect. So to put it like in simplest terms, if you're looking at a shelf in a nursery, and it doesn't matter in our data whether or not it's a small nursery or a big nursery, there's a 1 out of 3 chance that if you grab a plant and a monarch caterpillar is eating it, that there's going to be some compound above a level that messes with its development. But that has to be an underestimate because most of the compounds aren't studied, but we don't have any idea how much of an underestimate. So I hesitate to even rely too much on that 30%. It's pretty bad, right? The whole situation there is not good. So that's why rinsing the leaves really is something, getting rid of some soil, favoring seeds, native seedlings. Also, if you have a real local nursery, um, I talked to one person here, Rail City in Reno, is sort of as a local nursery, has been around a long time. They really grow their plants there. They do use some pesticides, but they were very open to this problem. They're just like, we hadn't thought about this, right? So it's possible if you have a real local owner, you can talk to them, and maybe they'll even cut their pesticides in half. I don't know, and put a sign up that says these plants don't look perfect because we don't use pesticides in the rearing process. You're going to buy them with some damage on the leaves because they're living plants that get eaten by things. So talk to your local nursery folks. There is hope there.
Yeah, definitely. And we have a campaign called Buy and Be Safe Plants, and we have a whole brochure on how to talk to local nurseries. Peer pressure is sort of in our favor for this one. Like you said, for nurseries that may not even think about that or be knowledgeable in that
Yes.
area. And I did want to mention the study you were talking about was with, I think Aaron Anderson is yeah. So he is actually going to do a webinar, I believe, in April or May. If you check our website, registration will be up in about a month or so for that. But he's going to talk about the results of that study. And yeah, it was very interesting for the yards that have never sprayed
Yeah.
still have pesticides in them. And then people who do spray also volunteered to be a part of the project. And yeah, it's very interesting. So I'm excited to hear about the results of that
Yep.
study. And
Yep.
then we're going to end on one more question that Amber's going to ask.
Yeah, to finish us off here, some folks, we're getting questions and comments, are concerned about getting this information out to more people. Two-part question here. What can people do, like recommendations on how to share this data with more people, and also how to talk to people about butterfly decline?
Yeah. Those are that's really maybe the hardest question.
Saved
I
it for last.
Yeah, that's right. Um, I think the Xerces Society websites, I believe you have sites that have sort of good facts on the problem of insect declines in general that people can use as talking points. Um, But in general, my strategy has been to remind people that insects are part of the biodiversity crisis, right? Because sometimes you can talk to people about problems with insects, and you know that in the back of their mind they're thinking, insects. Like that people don't really like many people don't really like insects, or they feel like no matter what you say there's enough of them, it can't matter. So I find it's helpful to remind people that butterflies and insects are part of the global biodiversity crisis, but they happen to be ones that respond to things you do in your own backyard. If you use less pesticides in your backyard, that is good for butterflies, and it's a more immediate impact than conservation for vertebrates that might not live anywhere near you. um, Other than that, I really don't have any magical answers on how to convince folks to think about butterfly conservation. It's something I struggle with all the time, I think, as many of us do.
Yeah, definitely. I lied. We have another question that came in that I want to ask if that's okay.
Yeah.
Anthony made it in just below the wire. Wouldn't you say this is a really good question and a good point? Wouldn't you say that large box stores selling plants generally sell plants that have been treated by pesticides, and that, as you said, your best bet is to go to local nurseries? Is that always the case?
So when I mentioned the local nursery, I mentioned the idea that if you have a truly local nursery, you might be able to talk to the owner. But in our data, it was not the case that the big box stores were worse. I
Mhm.
kind of wish it was. That would be simple, right? But the fact is that nurseries across the country tap into these really complicated supply chains. And just because it looks like a charming local nursery doesn't mean they're not buying from the same sources as Home Depot down the road. So it's not as simple as go to small nurseries. What you got to do is talk to small nurseries because they might be more amenable to that. I mean, I know we should wrap up here, but it's really amazing how complicated these supply chains were. I hadn't realized until I got into that it's as complicated as sometimes when you buy a plant from a shelf in a nursery, it might have started life as a seedling in another country and then spent weeks in the hold of a ship getting here. Well, what do you think you have to do to a plant that's in the hold of a ship? You have to cover it in fungicide so that it doesn't rot. So just that complicated journey means the plants are continually doused with these things to keep them looking pristine. But it's not as simple as store size, but you could talk to local stores. That's the only hope, I think.
Yeah, definitely. I've had good luck with our local native plant society. All the society members actually harvest from their own yards and propagate plants, and they bring them to like one of our farmers markets every year. So we always go and get native plants from there because I know they're not using pesticides and they've created them in their own yard, which is kind of a cool way to do it, or find folks that want to share plants in your neighborhood.
Yeah, thank you. Again, local seeds and local seedlings is going to be great.
Mhm. Yeah, but that whole story and supply chain is so interesting, and we don't think about it because we don't know. Well,
Yeah.
thank you so much, Matt. This was so interesting, and thank you for all of your work. It's just obviously it's a lot of work that's kind of culminated to even be able to know that butterflies are in decline, and it's important for us to know that so that we can take action. And we appreciate you being such a great partner and collaborator with us, and it's just been a real pleasure to get to hear from you again today. Thank you to our audience for joining us. We hope to see you on our next webinar. Check out that Bug Banter episode coming out in 2 Tuesdays from this week. And thank you, Amber, so much for being here today. I hope you all have a wonderful day.
Great. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.